Hey everyone, thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Ever wondered how faith, often seen as this really personal thing, can actually ignite social justice movements, even spark revolutions? Today we're really plunging into a topic that's fundamentally reshaped religious thought and got millions moving: liberation theology. You've shared an incredible stack of sources with us: historical stuff, academic insights, real world accounts, and what our mission is to cut through all that complexity and hopefully deliver some of those aha moments for you.
That's right. Today we're sort of setting out to understand not just what liberation theology is, but, why it came about, the really radical shifts it proposed, and its lasting global impact. We'll trace its tumultuous birth, mainly in Latin America, see how its powerful ideas then spread out and adapted across the world, and finally look at its enduring legacy and the pretty crucial questions it asks of us even now.
Yeah, think of it like uncovering how this view from below didn't just inspire new prayers, right?
Yeah.
It actually ignited active struggles against oppression. It's about much more than just theology. It's a story about power, about extreme poverty, and that persistent human drive for freedom. So let's get into it. What were those sort of foundational sparks? What really lit this particular fire?
Okay, let's start unpacking this incredible story. Our sources make it super clear that liberation theology wasn't some abstract idea cooked up in an office somewhere. It was forged in the really fiery conditions, the specific historical and social situation in Latin America. What were those foundational pressures, that unique tinderbox maybe that ignited this?
Tinderbox is a great way to put it. I mean, you can trace some philosophical threads back centuries, yeah. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas in colonial times questioning the brutal treatment of indigenous people. But the real accelerant, the immediate cause, was that socio-political pressure cooker of the mid-20th century. The 1950s and 60s saw this wave of powerful populist leaders across Latin America, figures like Perón in Argentina, Vargas in Brazil. They championed national development. But as our sources show, while this created a sense of national pride and some industrial growth, it also created this shadow economy for huge numbers of people.
So this promise of national progress, it had a really dark side, didn't it?
Exactly. While the middle classes, maybe urban workers, often saw benefits, vast numbers of peasants were pushed into deeper rural poverty or ended up in these sprawling urban shantytowns. This whole development process happened along lines that our sources call dependent capitalism. Imagine a global economic seesaw, right? Where the rich center nations gained enormous wealth, often directly at the expense of these periphery nations, trapping them in underdevelopment. This extreme inequality, it sparked powerful popular movements demanding deep changes. And the governments, often they responded with brutal military dictatorships, cracking down hard to protect capital. And in that volatile mix, the socialist revolution over in Cuba really stood out. Many saw it as a possible path, a way to break free from this dependence.
Okay, so we've got this intense social, economic, political pressure cooker situation. But at the same time, our sources talk about this great wind of renewal blowing through the churches themselves, starting in the 60s. How did that spiritual shift play into things?
Oh, it was absolutely critical. The Second Vatican Council, Vatican II, from 62 to 65, was a massive turning point. Yeah. It wasn't just about new theological ideas. It actually gave theoretical justification for a theology of progress and human advancement. It basically told the church, hey, re-engage with the modern world. And that spurred lay people, charismatic bishops, priests, to take their social mission much more seriously. They started forming groups like Young Christian Students and, really importantly, the first base ecclesial communities, or CEs as they became known. These were small grassroots gatherings for prayer, Bible study, but also social action.
And this wasn't just about, charity work, was it? There was a deeper intellectual engine, a new way of thinking driving this whole shift.
Precisely. This period saw this really vigorous wave of sociological thinking that started to, rip away the veil. It revealed the true systemic causes of underdevelopment. It argued that development and underdevelopment weren't separate things. They were two sides of the same coin. That the poverty of the so-called third world was often the direct result of the first world's overabundance. This critical analysis, plus the church's renewed social focus, really undermined the old theology of development, which often just suggested charity without asking the hard questions about why poverty existed. And that laid the true theoretical foundations for a theology of liberation. The material foundations really kicked in when popular movements and Christian groups started working together in the struggle for social and political freedom.
Right. So with the stage now set by this huge shift in Latin America, a whole new kind of theological thinking was about to erupt. And our sources show this wasn't just about applying old doctrines to new problems. It was about radically reimagining what faith itself meant. So how did these thinkers, these courageous people, start rewriting the theological playbook?
Well, that atmosphere of freedom and creativity from Vatican II really empowered theologians in Latin America to think for themselves. It was a big deal. Suddenly you had both Catholic thinkers like Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff, and Protestant thinkers Rubem Alves, Jose Miguel Bonino, starting this intense shared reflection. They were looking at faith, poverty, social justice, but from their immediate reality.
And among them, Gustavo Gutierrez became this really pivotal figure. He famously described theology in a way that completely turned traditional thinking on its head, right?
He certainly did. Gutierrez described theology as critical reflection on praxis. Now, that sounds academic, but it was a bombshell. It fundamentally redefined what theology is. It means theology isn't just abstract thought separate from life. It actually emerges from revolutionary action taken on behalf of the poor and oppressed. His major work, Theologia de la Liberación, published in 1971, really cemented this whole methodology. It was basically a call for theologians not to be just thinkers, but practitioners immersed in the struggle. Theory and the fight for justice became inseparable. And that was a radical break from centuries of tradition.
So once these radical foundations were laid, a whole distinct set of theological ideas started coming out. What did this all mean for how we understand core Christian concepts, things people often take for granted?
Okay, so now, with this understanding of praxis, this critical question emerges. How did liberation theologians reframe fundamental Christian doctrines? How did they align them with this view from below, with the actual struggles of oppressed people? Central to this, absolutely core, was the concept of the preferential option for the poor. This is a powerful idea, basically saying that Christians have an obligation, first and foremost, to care for the poor and the vulnerable.
And our sources show this had huge implications for understanding something like sin, didn't it? It sounds like a complete rethink.
Oh, it was a revolutionary redefinition of sin. It really shifted the moral focus from just individual guilt to collective responsibility. Sin wasn't seen primarily as just an individual private act anymore. It was seen as a social historical fact, the absence of brotherhood and love, and how people relate to each other. So, for instance, entire capitalist nations could be seen as sinful, not just for individual acts, but for their very structure, the way they extracted wealth from poorer countries. That's tied into dependency theory. And crucially, just passively accepting or acquiescing to oppression. That was also seen as a sin. Imagine the impact of that. This also meant rethinking salvation. It wasn't just about eternal life anymore, but about bringing about the kingdom of God right here on earth, a new social order with equality, where, as they said, history and eternity intersect.
So God isn't just like a distant observer in this framework waiting for us in the afterlife.
Not at all. God is portrayed as not impassive or just out there. God is dynamically involved, specifically on behalf of the poor and the downtrodden. To truly know God, in this view, is to do justice. And Jesus Christ. His significance really lies in his example struggling for the poor, the outcast. The incarnation is seen as God's total immersion into man's history of conflict and oppression and his death. Maybe not just vicarious sacrifice, but because he fundamentally upset the religious political situation of his time by challenging the powerful and siding with the marginalized.
And how did this fundamentally challenge the role of the church itself? What was its job now?
The church's mission, seen through this lens, became less about, quantitative soul-saving, just counting heads. It became much more about protesting injustice, challenging inhumanity, and actively siding with the poor and the oppressed. And this is where those grassroots base ecclesial communities, the CEs, became so vital. There were these local hubs for prayer, Bible study, sure, but also for social action. They help people organize for their own welfare and community empowerment.
Wow. That's a profound, even radical shift in perspective. But, as our sources also point out, this didn't come without friction. There were major controversies, especially around the methods used. It sounds like not everyone was thrilled.
Indeed. And what's really fascinating here is the use of Marxist social analysis. Now, this is a tricky point. Liberation theologians adopted Marxist categories for social analysis. They use them as tools, to understand structural inequality, class oppression, like using a specific type of X-ray to diagnose society's illness. However, our sources are pretty clear. They generally did not espouse Marxism as a holistic plan of political action. They weren't signing up for the whole ideology or its atheism. They saw it as a useful lens, not a replacement creed.
But that connection to Marxism, even just as an analytical tool, still kicked up a lot of dust, didn't it? Especially when combined with discussions around, well, the use of violence. That must have put the official church in a really difficult spot.
Absolutely. Some liberation theologians argue that violence might not be sinful if it was used purely for resisting oppression. Some even made distinctions, saying certain actions, like killing, might be sinful as done by an oppressor, but perhaps not as done by the oppressed, purely to remove deep inequities. Now, this was hugely controversial, obviously, and the Church's official teaching authority, the magisterium, was watching very closely. Initially, some church documents, like Justice in the World from '71, seemed to show some sympathy, some subtle nods to these concerns. But by 1984, the Vatican issued a pretty stern instruction, explicitly warning against the uncritical acceptance of Marxism. What's really interesting, though, is just 2 years later, another document, the Instruction on Christian Freedom and Liberation, took a more nuanced stance. It affirmed action for rights and even accepted armed struggle, but only as a last resort against obvious and prolonged tyranny. It was a real balancing act, trying to acknowledge legitimate grievances while guarding against what they saw as dangerous ideologies.
Right, so the Vatican was walking this tightrope, and our sources also detail pretty sharp criticisms coming from evangelicals who viewed this whole liberationist approach with deep suspicion. What was their main objection?
Yeah, evangelicals really push back against what they called the liberationist hermeneutic, basically, the whole method of interpreting scripture and Christian belief.
Mm-hmm.
They argued that by putting praxis, action and social context first before traditional theology, it led to a gross distortion of Christianity. They felt it lacked controlling exegetical criteria. They believed truth isn't something that just changes with the times, and that this preferential option for the poor, while maybe well-intentioned, was an alien pre-understanding.
Mm-hmm.
They thought it obscured the biblical truth of universal sin, that everyone, rich or poor, is sinful and universal salvation offered through Christ. They argued the gap between rich and poor was a symptom of humanity's fallen state, not the root cause itself. It was a really fundamental disagreement about where you even start doing theology.
Okay, so while Latin American liberation theology was really blazing the trail, this wasn't just happening in one place. How did these powerful ideas travel? How did they resonate and transform across the globe, adapting to different kinds of struggles?
That's a crucial question because it shows the adaptability of the core ideas. What's fascinating is how these principles spawned this whole family of theologies, each tackling different forms of oppression. So beyond Latin America, liberation theology became this much broader phenomenon. For instance, you had Black liberation theology emerging powerfully, especially in the U.S. and South Africa. It focused squarely on racism and the systemic injustice faced by people of African descent. Key figures like James Cone reinterpreted the gospel specifically to empower people to overcome that oppression, drawing heavily on narratives like the Exodus story or parts of Luke's gospel. In South Africa, it became this fierce spiritual and intellectual force behind the anti-apartheid movement, really emphasizing human dignity, championed by people like Steve Biko.
And this framework also opened up new perspectives within the church itself, didn't it? Regarding things like gender or other forms of marginalization.
Yeah, exactly. Feminist liberation theology emerged, critiquing patriarchy within both society and the church, seeking gender equality. They drew motivation from verses like Galatians 3:28, the one about neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female.
Mm.
The aim was to really reconceptualize Christian theology entirely from women's lived experiences, exposing misogyny and trying to recover more egalitarian traditions within Christianity's history. And our sources mention so many other forms, it really shows how flexible these ideas were. Dalit theology in India, fighting the caste system, Minjung theology in Korea, Palestinian liberation theology, indigenous theology, even Northern Irish liberation theology, focusing on the Troubles, and deaf liberation theology. Each one took those core principles, the preferential option, understanding sin structurally, seeking liberation, and applied them to their unique contexts. It created this truly global conversation.
It's incredible how those core ideas were applied so differently. But the movement itself, it hasn't stayed static, has it? It's continued to evolve, especially after those massive global shifts in the late 80s.
Absolutely. The shifting sands of global politics, particularly the collapse of Marxist ideologies in Eastern Europe after 1989, that brought significant changes. It led to a kind of reassessment for many liberation theologians. They started to focus less, perhaps, on grand socialist revolution models and more on the spiritual sources and implications of liberation. There was a sort of concession, maybe, that socialism simply doesn't work in the way they might have once envisioned. This led to maybe more ambiguity about what socialism even meant in that context, and perhaps a greater acceptance or at least engagement with Western-style democracy as a potential tool, however flawed, against oppression.
So a bit of a shift, maybe from focusing so much on the big political ideology towards something more personal, more spiritual.
In many ways, yes. This shift meant a renewed emphasis on spirituality. You see it in the writing. More recent books tend to have noticeably more biblical references and maybe less overt social analysis compared to the earlier stuff. Spiritual disciplines like prayer, devotion, Bible studies focusing on specific liberation passages. Think of Mary's Magnificat. Her song of social reversal became more central within those CEs. At the same time, another huge factor, especially impacting Latin America, has been the massive explosion of evangelical Protestantism. Millions turn towards movements that really emphasize individual salvation through individual change and often link faith directly to economic advancement through strong community support and, frankly, a disciplined work ethic. That presented a very different model for change.
So what does all this mean for the legacy of liberation theology today? Has it kind of faded away, or does it still shape religious thought?
Oh, despite those shifts, its core ideas remain incredibly influential. It continues to push for a worldview that sees the world often characterized more by conflict than compromise, inequality than equality, oppression rather than liberation. Perhaps the most visible contemporary example, Pope Francis. The first Latin American pope, he's clearly drawn from liberationist ideas. His powerful advocacy for economic justice, for environmental stewardship, often framed using that language of a preferential option for the poor, it really signals a kind of renewed engagement within the institutional church with many of these core concerns. And liberation theology continues to inspire critiques of things like neoliberalism and solidarity efforts all across the global south. It's definitely not just a historical relic.
Okay, this is where the theory really hit the ground. Our sources give us some really concrete, often inspiring examples of how this theology actually translated into action, how it made a tangible difference in people's lives. What did that look like?
Yeah, what's truly fascinating is seeing how these intellectuals and these grassroots communities became these really dynamic forces for actual change. Take Brazil, for example. The CEBs there were incredibly active on the ground. They defended indigenous tribes and peasant farmers from land grabs, from exploitation. They initiated community health programs like tackling widespread malnutrition in places like Nova Iguala. They helped whole communities negotiate for better living standards, for basic services. They became this powerful vehicle for that initial consciousness raising, helping people understand their situation wasn't just fate, it was structural. They fostered a deep sense of community and empowered people for direct political action. It wasn't just individuals acting alone, it was communities organizing. That's a huge shift.
And the intellectuals, they played a critical role in mobilizing people, didn't they? They weren't just locked away writing books, they were sparking movements.
They absolutely did. Figures like Gustavo Gutierrez, our sources describe them acting as ideological bridges. They used their influence, their connections within the church, within universities, local parishes, to actually mobilize organizational resources. They helped bring together different protest groups who might not have otherwise connected. Gutierrez, for instance, was able to crystallize this symbolic message for a whole new generation of Christian activists. He gave them a framework, a language, a spiritual grounding for the struggles they were already involved in.
And this sounds like it challenged some really fundamental societal norms, even beyond just poverty.
It really did. The liberation theologies actively encouraged thinking about the common good. They powerfully countered that relentless pull of consumerist and capitalist welfare, that individualistic mindset. For Africa, for instance, our sources suggest they offer a crucial framework to address what's called intra-racism, ethnic and tribal divisions. How? By emphasizing the inherent distinctiveness and the fundamental right to existence of every single people group, fostering unity against common oppressors. At its absolute heart, it reminds us that theology can't just be talk. It has to have practical expression, that God is intimately involved in our real-life situations, and that understanding leads to a critical awareness of your own situation, which then ideally leads to action for improvement, not just passively waiting for leaders, but actively participating in shaping a more just world.
So as we kind of wrap this up, what does all of this mean for you listening? What challenge does this deep dive maybe present?
Well, it certainly pushes us to consider, doesn't it? How do we reconcile that clear biblical command to care for the poor with legitimate concerns about potential theological distortions. While we absolutely must be vigilant about uncritically accepting any ideology, our sources seem clear. The vigorous and healthy nucleus of liberation theology has actually done a lot to bring the message of the historical Jesus, the Jesus who sided with the marginalized, to the world's oppressed. It really challenges us to think about theology not as some abstract exercise just confined to classrooms or books, but as a potentially dynamic force for systematic change and reorientation in society. It emphasizes that Christian theology should play a significant role in public discourse, advocating for those who often have no voice.
We've traced this incredible journey of liberation theology from its really urgent birth in Latin America, where faith met profound injustice head-on, to its global influence on all these diverse movements and its ongoing evolution in our changing world. It's just such a powerful reminder that for millions, faith isn't just a private internal matter. It's a profound, sometimes revolutionary call to actually confront injustice out there in the world.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it challenges all of us. The sources clearly show a strong biblical basis for helping the poor. We can't really argue with that. So the question becomes, what does it mean for you personally to truly do justice in your own context? Not just theoretically, not just talking about it, but in action, while still remaining anchored in your core beliefs.
Yeah, it's a tension, isn't it? One many people still wrestle with, but it feels like an essential one. How do you see that balance between individual transformation and tackling those bigger structural changes when we talk about addressing the cries of the poor and oppressed today? What small part, or maybe large part, can you play in trying to bridge that gap? Definitely something to mull over as you continue your own deep dive. Thanks so much for joining us.